Lovely to meet you all. I'm doing a talk on Turkey. I think it might be a cliche, as Raf said, but it's the opposite to Cuba in the sense that it's a bridge country. It's frequently described as the bridge or the link between Asia and Europe and West and East. And especially during the Ottoman Empire, it was a kind of pivotal point in the Silk Road. And trade has been a huge part of Turkish experience for generations, and even in the modern day. Obviously, there's a huge manufacturing hub. So, in terms of kind of brief overview of the talk, I think I will go through what IATR is, what we do, what our kind of mission statement is, and then kind of go through the broad kind of lens how I see Turkish trade, or one lens of how I see Turkish trade. And we're going to kind of apply it to different case studies, the EU, the US, the Balkans, Central Asia, and finishing up with Israel. Kind of about IATR, obviously, Tarek briefly mentioned, but we're kind of we're a new think tank, we're a small think tank. We're kind of dedicated to building an institutional bridge between the UK and Turkey. But importantly, we're not the Institute of British-Turkish Relations. It's Anglo-Turkish, so we try to kind of branch out to all English-speaking countries, or hopefully the US eventually. And a quick disclaimer: I'm the leader as a think tank, but technically these views are very much my own as opposed to the Institute more broadly. Turkish trade flows, identity and interest, and what do I mean by that? I think, obviously, I'm at the bosom of the IEA, and this might be seen as kind of heretical, but trade doesn't always follow a solid economic logic. I think this is true for a lot of countries, but I think in Turkey in particular, for various reasons we'll get into. And a lot of instances of trade kind of defy a lot of these kind of neoliberal parameters you find. And I think in Turkey in particular, there is an argument to be made where there's an outside influence. It goes from being marginal to be quite decisive in a lot of different cases. And other factors, as we'll kind of get to in a second, such as domestic politics, identity, which I think is particularly important in the Turkish case, and geopolitics can often fill this gap. Starting off with domestic politics, we have a continued dominance of Erdogan of the AKP. Erdogan came to power in 2003, and I was born in 2000, right? So the AKP's rule is only 3 years older or younger than I am, and I only really known Erdogan as a leader of Turkey, and most analysis can suggest that he will kind of be in place for the foreseeable future, and it's had huge kind of transformative effects on Turkish society and policy making, and therefore trade policy. The old Kemalist foreign policy elite has been defenestrated, and for a long time in Turkey, even when there were kind of differences in domestic politics, foreign policy was always handled by a sort of kind of secular kind of elite establishment. And I think especially in recent years, in the last 5 to 10 years, following the coup attempt in particular, this kind of establishment has been kind of fully kind of defenestrated, and Erdogan and the AKP are put very much in firm control. And this has a huge kind of different impact. There's been growing Islamism, and that kind of shaped rhetoric and partner selection, and therefore sometimes, as we'll kind of get to, especially with certain trade partners such as Israel, can limit what you would think would be kind of economic pragmatic course of action. And again, I'm not one. I've been burned by kind of political predictions for a long time, so I try not to make them anymore. But it seems policy continuation on the AKP is probably the most likely kind of scenario. Turkey's many identities. Obviously, Turkey has a long and storied history. It has a rich culture, and it's been marked by kind of lots of different identities, if you will. Obviously, you have the kind of Ottoman era, then you're going into the modern republic, and then the not so modern republic today, and all these different kind of eras in Turkish politics and society are kind of shaped by these different kind of overarching kind of narratives and the way Turkish people identify themselves. So we can go through some of them that we'll kind of be covering today. We have Islamism, obviously, this idea of kind of Turkey has a long history during the Ottoman Empire, home to the Sultan, home to the Caliphate, and obviously this is kind of a resurgence in some ways under the AKP. You have Turkism, right? The idea of Turkish ethnic identity and how that has links to places like Central Asia, Eastern China, even, and how those kind of historic ethnic links are kind of utilized and used by Turkish foreign policy establishments. And Westernism, right, again, in some ways this has been kind of diminished in recent years due to various factors. But this idea of that Turkey does even to this day, does kind of see itself as a Western power on the periphery, but still, it's in NATO, it's in the Council of Europe, and it does, depending on who it's speaking to, frankly, define itself as a Western power. And then obviously neo-Ottomanism, and I think it's really important when we speak about places like the Middle East, like the Balkans, and this idea of the kind of resurgence of this imperial identity and what that means for Turkey. Geopolitics, again, I'm not, I think identity and issues around identity can be interesting, but I don't think, I'm not necessarily an identitarian when it comes to questions of international relations. I do think geopolitics does place some structural constraints, and I think Turkey more than others, right? Because Turkey doesn't have the liberty to kind of pursue these identitarian concerns to its utmost degree, because ultimately it is a very precarious neighborhood, right? It's bordered by powerful neighbors such as Russia in the north, by failed states and instability in the south, and it's ultimately really energy dependent, right? It kind of imports nearly 75% of its energy needs, and those sort of kind of twin kind of pillars, if you will, act as strong guardrails to Turkish foreign policy making and Turkish trade, despite these other more lavish pursuits in other identitarian concerns. So therefore, I think and we'll see this, and I think this is an important point. This is the idea that this is somewhat my intellectual cowardice coming out, right? I mean, any good social scientist, if you ask them, what is the answer? Usually it depends, or it's complex. And with Turkish trade, it's no different. I think these kind of factors, they rarely ever operate in isolation, nor they are in every instance one kind of superior to the other. They usually kind of reinforce each other, they can define each other, and they can play off of each other. And with all these kind of different things, a kind of understanding Turkish trade more than anything, it does require this multifaceted lens, and these kind of factors are just kind of lenses that you can kind of overlay over each other. And when you come to a specific instance, as we'll kind of see, it's you can very rarely explain the entirety of the phenomena with one of these lenses. It's usually a multitude and working them together and kind of reinforcing each other. So the first kind of case study that I find really interesting is the EU and this idea of post-Westernism. Obviously, Turkey has a long relationship with the EU and its broader European allies, and obviously it's been defined by kind of its kind of quixotic accession process. And this idea that obviously since the 60s and 70s, Turkey has obviously aspired to become an EU member and has failed to do so. After the formation of the Turkish Republic, after the War of Independence, I would say Westernism and this idea of Turkey is seen itself as a Western nation with that high watermark. And Kemal Atatürk obviously very famously pushed forward with Westernization. And this sort of, despite this sort of push, despite its kind of high watermark, Turkey has always kind of grappled with itself as kind of the sense of it being an outsider in Europe. Obviously, it is majority Muslim. It is on the periphery of Europe, geographically speaking. Obviously, the vast majority, geographically speaking, is in Asia. And therefore, this idea of being an outsider in Europe is kind of always played heavy in the mind of Turks and their foreign policy establishment. And even under the AKP, which kind of sees itself as primarily Islamic manner, they still push forward with Westernization in the EU, and the AKP went to kind of great lengths to push forward with the Copenhagen criteria, which is the list of kind of demands the EU makes on you to become a EU member. And the AKP was kind of doing, kind of trudging through these requirements effectively, and obviously at the end of the day, they were still told no for various reasons. And but this sort of kind of perceived rejection, both at the kind of grassroots and the elite level, and the weakening of this kind of more pro-Western Kemalist elite, kind of led to a kind of broader pivot away from Westernism. And I think what that means for today, I think the kind of ongoing kerfuffle about the Turkish buying Russian oil is a great example of this, and this idea of kind of post-Westernism. And I think it's a great factor. It's a great example where identitarian factors, while I think they're interesting and fun, it's a great example where they kind of take a back seat, right? As idea that support for membership remains high, yes, at 56%, but accession is no longer that sort of carrot to be dangled in front of the Turks is no longer there. And therefore, it's not really kind of important to the Turkish definition of the self. And because of that, the other kind of perceptions such as strategic autonomy, third power, being its own thing, not necessarily being a part and outsider in the West, is I think the kind of dominant mood in large parts of Turkey, and what that has led to, this weakening of identitarian factor, if you will, is a reversion back to more kind of traditional economic concerns regarding kind of material benefit, material support, and I think the kind of continued purchase of Russian oil are a great example. I think a generation ago, if the Turks were still trying to come over to the EU, would they be buying Russian oil in the same way, so overtly? I doubt it. But nowadays, because that kind of carrot is no longer there, because the self-conception is no longer there, well, the fact Russian oil is very cheap, and it's to the benefit of our economy, so therefore we'll go ahead with it. And that sort of kind of normative concerns, such as democracy, being a team player, being a part of the international system, the Western-led international system, is no longer as important in Turkey, and thus their kind of economic and trade flows reflect that. Being the kind of the Russian case being a great example. The US and the F-35 cycle, I think, again, very similar. I think I would group the EU and the US somewhat very loosely together as a sort of broader Western Turkish relations, if you will, and this idea of kind of status anxiety within the sort of very asymmetric alliance, and this idea that Turkey did kind of mirror some similar concerns regarding we're outsiders, we're not taken seriously. We're not taken to the same kind of sincerity as the British or the French because of the various reasons around the periphery. We're a Muslim majority country. I think during the Cold War, that I think what literature always showed is that this didn't matter as much, right? Because you had huge, powerful Soviet Union in the north, and therefore all these kind of smaller concerns kind of put to the wayside. But I think especially after in the post-Cold War era, as kind of Turkey is becoming increasingly confident in itself and becomes increasingly kind of proud of its kind of third power kind of self-conception. These sort of issues of you don't take us seriously, and I think the great example is the US support for the SDF in Syria, right? The SDF, the Turks see it as a offshoot of the PKK, which is a terror organization based in Turkey, and the Turks said, well, we're NATO allies. We're supposed to be close friends. We're supposed to be close comrades. Why are you supporting an organisation that we see as fundamentally kind of against our national interest? And I think another great example is the F-35, right? Yeah, and again, people always focus on the F-35 within its kind of material capability, but I think the identitarian concerns are so important, right? A brief history of Turkey's relation with the F-35. I was told by someone who worked on the F-35 program that Turkey was seen as a very pivotal country in the program. The Turks went and bought a Russian-made air defense system called the S-400, and they were booted out unceremoniously. And ever since, the Turks have kind of long sought to rejoin. President Erdogan recently visited the US and made a re-acceptance of the program a huge part of its kind of his diplomatic push. And it's a great example of where trade and politics have intermingled, where he essentially bought 225 Boeing aircraft as a sort of sweetener for the F-35 deal. They'd say, let's back the F-35, we'll do a bunch of these things, we'll get rid of the S-400, and we'll buy all these kind of Boeing aircraft. But I think beyond what the F-35 can do and its material abilities, there is what the F-35 symbolizes for Turkey. The Turks look around and they say, the Brits have the F-35, the Greeks are going to get the F-35, the Israelis have the F-35, the Saudis even going to get the F-35. So we're NATO members, we're supposedly serious players within the Western alliance. We help you in places like Gaza, we help you in places like Syria, we help you in places like Ukraine, but you're not giving us the F-35. What does that mean? Do you take us as seriously as these other characters? And I think the sort of kind of surface level geopolitics of it is very obvious to a lot of people, and it's quite plain to see. But the underlying symbolic and identitarian concerns, I think, warrant further investigation as well. The Balkans and the partial rise of neo-Ottomanism. I think while this is the same thing with Central Asia, we'll get to in a second. But with both, I think this is a great example of where kind of narrative analysis, identity analysis, these are really interesting, and I think they do have value, but I think people often get carried away. And I think in the Balkans is a great example. I think, obviously, Turkey ruled over large parts of the Balkans directly during the Ottoman Empire, and that kind of created these sort of in places like Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina, these sort of kind of Muslim communities that still have strong links back to through religion back to Turkey, and these sort of kind of legacies have kind of created these sort of wells of influence that you find the Turks using, whether it's infrastructure projects, whether it's trade, and this kind of soft power has been used for a while now. But I think a lot of observers that you find often it's very quite sensational. It's the idea of Turkey's neo-Ottoman ambitions, right? And I think is a great example where narrative can get carried away, where again it's very sensational, right? You have Erdogan as the new sultan, the Janissaries, knocking on the doors of Vienna, and it's a very cool story that people tell each other. But I think again, what is the perception, what is the narrative, and what is the practice? And I think Turkey's engagement again is kind of construed as sort of neo-Ottoman revival, but again the facts just don't kind of reflect that narrative. I think Turkish Stream is a great example. It's a sort of energy project going from Russia down through the Balkans to Turkey. And there is no why is Turkey doing this with Russia? It's a classical rival in the Balkans, right? It's sort of on top of that as well. It goes to all these kind of anti-Turkey, non-Muslim powers, to Serbia, right? And it's this idea that if Turkey was framing its engagement in the region in this sort of neo-Ottoman framing, would it really be pursuing this? I very much doubt it. Again, this is probably a more classic, hard power geopolitical interests at play. Turkey needs energy and doesn't really care about its kind of, Ottoman ambitions in the Balkans. It needs energy and it's going to get it. And then in terms of actual on-the-ground FDI, Turkey is a relatively minor player, 3 to 15%, ranging on the country. And Turkey is an important, but it's not a dominant actor. The Balkans remained a kind of Russian and EU kind of playing field, and the Turks are kind of a relatively minor player. And in that way, neo-Ottomanism is the packaging, not the substance, right? It's a cool story, and but you don't want to get carried away with it because ultimately, the kind of on the ground facts, trade looks far more based on EU and Russian dominance than kind of Turkish neo-Ottoman revival. And I think a similar kind of vein with Central Asia. It's the idea of Turkism and how I often find it quite overstated. And there's a history of Turkey and Turkism. Obviously, Turkey ethnically made up of Turks who share kind of genetic lineage with peoples in Central Asia, such as Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, etc. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, obviously all these places were newly kind of independent. And Turkey was one of the first countries to actually acknowledge these countries and work with them. You had shared language, you had shared history, and Turkey was able to and still does, leverage these links, linguistic and historical, to act as a kind of trade kind of loosener, if you will. This idea that, yes, it's true, if I go to Turkmenistan, I can roughly make out what they're saying, so it's easier for me to trade in Turkmenistan than I imagine my American compatriot. But, again, is it kind of be overstated? I often find it does. I think on two levels, again, similar to the Balkans, it's a two-player game between the Russians and the Chinese. The Turks, remain a relatively minor power. They, I think, more doors have been opened to them with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and a lot of these Central Asian partners are looking to diversify away from the Russians. But again, the role remains limited. On top of that, even on a narrative identitarian basis, I think this idea of Turkism can be kind of overstated more from the Turkish side, where the Turkish say, we're Turkic brothers, we share a language, we share a history, and then a lot of kind of population in Central Asia turn around and say, look, yeah, maybe, but we have quite distinct history. We have a distinctly Central Asian history. We have years of Soviet domination. You guys didn't have that, and are we really Turkish brothers? And what does that actually mean? Not to say it's not there. I mean, it is used, it is leveraged, but again, we should be careful with overstating it. Israel, I think obviously this is a hugely important topic, obviously massively in the news, and I think Turkey's relationship with Israel is pretty fascinating. Turkey was the first Muslim majority country to recognize Israel when it was formed as a state. And during Westernization, during that kind of previously mentioned high watermark Westernization, Turkey and Israel maintained very close relations. And the idea was, we're Western power, right? That's how Turkey defined itself. And what defined the Western power? Well, one thing that defined the Western power back then, especially, was support for Israel, right? Generally speaking, the East or the Third World would support the Palestinians, while the Western powers, the developed world, was for Israel, and Turkey put itself on the latter side of the ledger, right? Where Western power and what Western powers do is they support Israel. But it was very much elite dominated. I think even to the recent day, it remained elite dominated. I think if you polled the majority of Turks when recognition happened, I don't think they would have supported it. But obviously, the kind of back then, the Kemalist elite had a different kind of thrust. And obviously, under the AKP and the decline of these kind of Kemalist elites, obviously, and post-Westernization, Turkey has defined itself differently, and it's kind of defined itself increasingly with Islamic identity and the idea that what's happening with support our fellow Muslims in places like Gaza and the West Bank, and what that looks like is kind of increasing anti-Israel rhetoric. But I think the interesting part is this idea that yes, we have the identity concerns, and Turkey was saying we're a Muslim power, and therefore we're going to support Palestine. But what you find with the trade relationship is actually it remains strong up until very recently. And despite all the identity concerns, geopolitics seemed to reign, right? And there was that sort of strategic economic relationship that was flourishing up until recently. And this was up until recently. And this is where I think domestic politics is a great kind of indicator where, despite the sort of sustained anti-Israel rhetoric, Turkey actually maintained very strong economic ties with Israel. And trade remained powerful and linked up until very recently. And what you found was that there was kind of increasing domestic and electoral pressure against the AKP. There were other Islamist parties that were saying you're hypocrites. You're talking a great game in the Turkish parliament. You're lambasting the Israelis for this and that, but you're still maintaining trade. If anything, trade has strengthened under you guys. How do you kind of square the two together? And these sort of kind of accusations of hypocrisy eventually kind of got to the AKP establishment. They say, actually, yes, we're going to lose out to the other Islamist parties unless we, talk the talk. And I think what you saw there was that, there was conflict between identity, right? Because in identity terms, Turkey was a Muslim power, but geopolitics meant that they were still trading with Israel. But then domestic politics comes in at the end and says, actually, no. If you really want to define yourself as an Islamic power and you don't get electorally punished for it, you have to go through with this. And then eventually they cut off all trade, despite it being very economically beneficial. And I think I can't remember the exact figures, but I think about 20 to 25 billion worth of trade. I think Turkey was Israel's third largest import partner, and cutting and severing that off obviously was kind of damaging for both sides. But again, it's a great example where economic logic can kind of overridden by domestic concerns or identitarian concerns. I think with further, I think this is these kind of case studies show that obviously there are even more factors than I've mentioned, but those three factors that I find really interesting, I find really captivating, I find really illustrative. But this thing, it's never an exact science. Ultimately, these things can ebb and flow. And as we've seen with different cases, we see with the European case where identity concerns have ebbed away in favour of kind of traditional geopolitics. And we see with Central Asia and the Balkans where identity can, if anything, be overstated and cannot be perhaps as important as you might think it is. And we see the Israeli case, actually no, identity can be really important. And again, these things are never exact science. I hate to say it, it's very much my intellectual cowardice, but it's complex and it depends. And it really does depend on the circumstance.